This is the Psychology to Live By podcast, where we discover how to live life a little better.
For me, it's been an ongoing, my whole life, a process of learning how to trust the process and learning how to coexist with self-doubt.
That's the voice of Drew Southwell, better known as indie singer, songwriter, producer and composer Portair. We had a free-flowing and candid conversation about music, mental health and creativity, in which we touched on many topics, including Drew's background as an artist, his drivenness to create and the factors that nurture his creativity, the centrality of uncertainty and the tolerance of ambiguity in the creative process, and how the meaning of what one creates often emerges much later. The foundation of symbol, metaphor and analogy in the creative process, learning to productively coexist with one's own self-doubt, the primacy of just doing or starting, the joys and the benefits of collaboration, Drew's own mental health experiences and how therapy very positively changed his life, the important distinction between healthy and unhealthy perfectionism, and other topics. It was a delightful and illuminating conversation for me, and I hope you experience it that way as well. All right, so here I am with Drew Southwell. How are you, Drew?
I'm good. How you doing?
Yeah, very good. It's nice to be talking to a fellow Aussie.
It's always nice to hear another Australian accent for me. I live in Germany, and before this I was living in the States, and so I really latch on to another Australian every time I meet them.
Yes. I have found, though, I must say, that having an Australian accent is not a disadvantage internationally. Have you found that?
I've definitely found it to be an advantage for sure.
Exactly.
Yeah, especially in America. I don't know. I think Americans really appreciate the Australian accent somehow. So I've used it to get out of speeding tickets before, which has been nice.
Very good. I mean, that's been my experience as well. I used to do a fair bit of public speaking, and I'm sure half of it was they just wanted to listen to the accent, not the content.
That's right. Yeah, it seems like that. Yeah.
All right, we've got a lot to talk about, and we've had a little a little chat before this podcast, and just to cover the territory for the listeners, there's a number of things we could cover. We certainly could be talking about creativity itself, the process therein, what encourages it, what inhibits it. We could talk about the relationships between creativity and mental good health and mental poor health. We could certainly talk about the music industry, and it maybe sort of tease apart why it has such poor outcomes with respect to mental health for people, for pretty much everyone in the industry. And maybe we could talk about just well-being in general. We'll see. I mean, I'm happy to talk about all of those, and we'll see. We'll have about a half an hour, so I guess the time will determine when we stop rather than us running out of things to talk about.
For sure. Sounds great.
Okay, so let's start. For people who may not know, could you just give us, a very brief little potted history of your artistic trajectory?
Absolutely, yeah. So as you mentioned, my name is Drew. My artist name is Portair. I started music when I was a child. I grew up and I played drums and guitar, and later on piano and singing. I played in multiple bands throughout high school, and eventually I played in a band for about 10 years back in Australia, and we were, pretty serious about pursuing it. The band didn't work out, which led me to moving to the States. I moved to LA when I was about 23, just about 24, and I had met a music manager out there, and I had just started working in production, and so I had kind of put the artist thing on hold after the band broke up, and was focusing heavily on how to be a producer, how to be a songwriter. I signed a small publishing deal out of Nashville, which led me to meeting other artists and writers, and that kind of got me into these rooms, and I started to be like a sponge and just learn from people. And then very quickly it came back around to me wanting to do the artist thing again, and so I started this project, and pretty quickly I had some interest from some labels. I had some music on television in the States, and then yeah, fast forward about to now, which is about 4 years later. I've been touring, um, and it's been a super an amazing experience actually. And so when I'm not doing this, I have a lot of other projects. I produce for other people. I've done a lot of work for composing and underscore in television, and yeah, it's kind of a mixed bag of things, really. I would say
Yeah.
the main thing is the artist project, but definitely my time is filled with every other kind of thing imaginable, it seems. And so, yeah, that's the nutshell, I would say.
Yeah, it's a great nutshell, and there's a lot of jumping off points there, I think, especially in terms of, I mean, in a sense, the last part has been a steep trajectory, but I'd suggest it would have been one that couldn't have happened without all the preceding immersion, even including the experience in the band,
Hmm.
all that work producing, as you said, I think you said soaking up like a sponge.
Yeah.
And I think that this is, well, for example, I might just give you the briefest of outlines of what I think are the factors that are important for creative process, and then maybe
Yeah.
we can come back to your story.
Go for it.
So I think there's a sort of all-encompassing factor I just call the social dimension, and that is no one creates in isolation. We're born
Hmm.
into a culture. We're born into all kinds of influences, the language we learn, what art is in our culture, and so one of the things that in your story is there's a lot of influences on you,
Yeah.
and you've availed yourself of collaborative ventures along the way, and
Hmm.
so the social dimension, I think it contains all the other factors which I would say are intrapsychic. They're inside the person, right? Or
Right.
they're more centered at the person. The biggest single contributor across all fields, doesn't have to be in the performing arts, for creativity is how much a person produces,
Mm.
how many variants they create, if you want to take a Darwinian view, right?
Right. Right.
So, and it just sounds to me like you've been producing variants since you were a kid,
Right.
right?
Yeah, it feels like that for sure.
Yeah, yeah, and we can come back to that and talk about why some people like that and other people not. And I would suggest to you it's a thing called intrinsic motivation.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, and we can come back, and then that then leads to absorption, and we'll dive into that. So anyway, so we've got this social frame, and then inside it, the person working really hard and for a long period of time, and
Mm.
driven by this pleasure and interest and fascination and passion and curiosity.
Yeah,
And then
that's it.
you have all of these, they interact, but there's a kind of emotional skill or a kind of intuitive feel that's at the center of all creativity. And very often when we invent something, come up with something, we don't realize the full significance of it till much later. In
Mm.
other
That's
words,
so true.
we're pulling up something that's got a larger, more abstract, more symbolic significance, and later on we see how it more or less wrote us rather than the other way around.
That's it. Yeah, that's so true. And I've experienced that countless times actually, especially in writing. It's
Yeah,
yeah, there's been many moments where I've written a song and not necessarily known so much where it came from or what it means. And then, you know,
yeah,
sometimes years later it'll be very specific to a situation that I'm going through or I've just gone through, and it's and that's the
yeah.
emotional part of it, I think, as well, which can be very powerful.
Yes, and I've got a sort of rough theory about I don't want to dive too deep into the psychology of it, but just to say that especially aesthetic creativity. So for example, for my doctorate, I interviewed fiction writers.
Hmm.
And when you were just talking, it just reminded me, one of the writers told me, she'd published her novel and it was quite successful. And she read a review of the novel, and just a detail in that, there's this pivotal scene in the novel. The guys are speleologists. The people that go into caves and climb in crevices and all this sort of
Yep.
stuff. And there's this scene, it's a woman, and there's this
Mm.
scene in which the cave gets narrower and narrower and narrower, and then changes direction. Instead of going horizontal, it starts heading upwards. And it gets to the point where they have to make a decision. Do I keep going or do I go back?
Right. Mm.
Because it's getting dangerously narrow. She's
Yeah.
literally... Anyway, decides to go ahead and can see a light. So thinks, okay, there's a way out. And squeezing up through this increasingly narrow passageway, her head pops out into an open field through tufts of grass, right?
Oh, wow. Cool.
And so it's beautiful, And
Yeah.
anyway, the reviewer said this is clearly the central metaphor of rebirth in the novel.
Mm. Yeah.
And the novelist said to me that the reviewer, was right, but I never thought of it that way.
Mm.
And she realised that the reviewer had accurately seen the whole thing that was writing her.
That's amazing.
It is amazing, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so when you think about writing, and particularly songwriting, just tell me a little bit about your process. I'll come back to the other factors. I think we might follow this thread for a bit.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and what you just described is so true. I mean, I think oftentimes in songwriting and a lot of creative fields um and endeavors like that, it does kind of, sometimes it can write you instead of you writing it.
Yeah.
And in my experience, I've had that, I don't know, many times, like where I don't know, I think the process behind it is quite interesting, because sometimes I will go into a writing session or a production session with a direct idea in mind, and I'll have some, I'm usually taking notes on my phone of things that could maybe be inspirations, and I think that sometimes that can lead to a very direct, very specific, okay, we're going in with this kind of motive, and other times it just kind of comes out and it doesn't really necessarily have any clear picture, but maybe it sounds cool and maybe it's interesting, and maybe for some reason I'm drawn to certain words and I don't really know why.
Yes.
And then and those ones are always interesting to me, because with that also, I think I also have a lot of self-doubt, as do most artists, and I think in those specific situations I have probably the most self-doubt, because I'm kind of thinking, okay, I'm writing this thing, I don't really know what it means, like, this maybe makes me second guess myself and think maybe it's not my best work sometimes, or maybe it is and I don't really realize it, and then sometime later it'll kind of reveal the meaning to it in a way, and that's really interesting to me. I actually just had
Yes.
that yesterday, actually, with a song I was finishing yesterday for a project that I'm working on at the moment, which is called Driftwood Choir, which is a project with another artist on the Network label. We got together about a year ago and we've been making an album together, and we had this song I just finished yesterday, and it has some, and I don't know, I really like the lyrics, but when we wrote it initially, I was kind of like, I think the other guy, Ed, was maybe more so leading the lyric writing, and I was just, participating and contributing, but it didn't really have a meaning for me in the moment. And then yesterday, as I completed the full picture, I had this realization of like, oh wow, I feel something from this, which is really cool.
Yeah, and it is um, a little bit of theory, I guess, here, but whatever the mind is, it's organised hierarchically, So, and what we largely think metaphorically. We think in terms of large abstract notions that can sort of contain a lot more complexity than we're aware of, right? And our access to that is often through, some sort of metaphor or analogy,
Right.
or as you say, it just might be the sound of a word, or the or a visual image, or a phrase, right? But what it's unlocking is these sort of quite vast chains of meaning, right? And gradually they can come up into consciousness. It's like when you looking at a great work of art. You actually have to take your time with it, and then there are layers of meaning. So that's really interesting. But the other little piece I'd like to ask you about there, you talked a bit about self-doubt. And yes, of course, by definition, you're working in a domain where there's sort of like deliberate uncertainty.
That's true. Yeah. Continuous and deliberate.
That's right. And I think I said to you earlier, I've done a fair bit of public speaking around creative process, including creatives. But this tolerance, learning this tolerance for ambiguity, is a really important skill to learn. And one of the writers I spoke to, he said he was a bit naive. His first novel was pretty successful, and then he got a publishing contract to do 2 or 3 more, I think. And I was going to use his name, but I don't know whether I've got the permission to, so I better not. Because you probably know him.
Okay.
But anyway, he said he naively thought the second novel was going to be easier.
Yeah, I can understand that.
Yeah, because the first one was so torturous, and he's written many successful award-winning novels since then, and he said to me, it never gets easier, but you develop a kind of confidence and I think what he meant was that not knowing and the uncertainty is not a sign of your inability or your lack of capacity.
Right.
And you learn to trust the process. And again, it's this feeling that a lot of artists say, and a lot of creators, inventors, etc. They often feel like the phenomenology of it, the feeling of it, is that they're a sort of conduit for this thing. That it sort of comes through them. Is that something that you felt?
Sometimes, yeah, definitely. And I think it can be quite interesting because it's for me, it's been an ongoing my whole life, a process of learning how to trust the process and learning how to coexist with self-doubt, because I think it's such a big thing that a majority of artists, I would say, deal with. And especially when you're in a field with, I think specifically in the music industry, I mean, this is applicable across all different types of industries, but in the music industry, it can be very showy, and it can be very, everyone's putting their music out and putting on these shows and putting themselves out in a way that the self-doubt for me is increased because I see around me all these other fantastic artists that I compare myself to subconsciously. And yeah, it's interesting because I always write. I write very regularly, and I have hundreds of songs, and I would say that probably the majority of them are not the best, but occasionally there is that really good one that I feel very latched onto, and I think going back to what you said about trusting the process is that's the whole point. Is like, okay, I have to learn how to live with my self-doubt and how to live with, okay, maybe I made something that I don't think is the best, but I'm going to try again tomorrow.
I'm sitting here restraining myself. There's so many things I want to say. Should I keep restraining myself?
No, go for it. No, that's the ball of my thoughts. So.
No, it's great. So a couple of things. The evidence is very clear across all creative endeavors that most of the things that people create are sort of not very good. Right. So part of the skill is just to produce enough variance. If you think about like evolution. Yeah.
That's true.
And then one variant fits really nicely into its little environmental niche, and it's selected, right? So we've got this Darwinian thing, but the difference is nature makes the selections in natural selection, but in your field, you're the one who spots the thing with value. So one of the aesthetic skills is being able to recognize the diamond in the rough.
Mm, that's right.
Right. Yeah. And you know, again, this idea that the more variance you create, the more likely you're going to get a diamond.
Yeah.
Now, the other little piece in this is this question of self-concern. And I've got an assumption here, which I'll test with you. And that is when you're really in the grip of self-concern, I'm assuming that can be destructive of your creative process.
That's right.
Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. I would say, I think there's a, yeah, I think there's a line that I tend to teeter on where it feels like, is it self, is it too much self-concern, or is it just the right amount, maybe? And I think there have been times where I've leaned into too much, and I then tend to become judgmental of myself.
Yes.
And I think that is the constant thing that I personally struggle, which can, lead us to the topic of mental health, I would say, in terms of music industry, is that because with that comes so many other different types of emotions, and that can be unhelpful, I would say. And but it's really hard to learn how to I don't know, accept that, and how to navigate that, and how to know when you're being the right amount of critical, and know when you're being, because I think there is a level of being critical to your work and your creative endeavors. And for me,
okay.
it's
I mean, you're right, and of course, this is a journey. A much overused metaphor, by the way, but this is something that all people have to deal with, is this issue of social comparison and self-concern, right?
Sure.
Yeah. And of course, it's massively amplified in modern life with social media, and we're constantly comparing ourselves to curated images and things that are perfect, and of course, it's not real. And people are cosmetically enhanced, and et cetera, et cetera. It goes on and on. But in my, one of the other factors that I think is very central to creative process is something I called egolessness. So the absence of ego.
Okay.
And it's not that one is permanently like that, but when you're really in the flow, in the zone, as it were, when you're in that creative absorption, that self-concern is absent.
Mm-hmm.
And it's more likely that the self-concern is there prior to and after, if you see what I'm getting at.
Yeah, absolutely.
And there are good brain reasons and hormonal reasons why that's the case, because if the self feels like it's under some sort of threat, the fight-flight system kicks in and hijacks the brain for survival purposes, right? Not for contemplative purposes.
Yes, that's true. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's this other interesting dimension. Although people can be plagued by self-concern, they do find ways of at least enough entering into this egolessness zone in order to create. And I would argue, and again, this is an assumption, and I'm interested in your experience, that's one of the seductions and the enticements and the joyous things about creative process is you find that's what really gives you that intrinsic pleasure and motivation.
Yeah, and that absolutely. And I think I heard this term yesterday, actually, which was called analysis paralysis, which I've been thinking about the past 12 hours. And what you just said,
hopefully not to the point of paralysis.
Right, exactly. But I think that in terms of creative process, for me, I tend to sometimes I'll tend to think too much about what I'm trying to create and what I'm trying to do, to the point where I don't actually start. And I think some of the best advice I've ever been given is just, and this was more so applicable to exercise, but I think it's applicable to any form of thing, is like just to start. It's with you just start doing, like, let's just say I'll just do 5 push-ups today, and then there's something that happens in the brain where you're like, well, I'm doing 5, I may as well go to 10, or and so I think for me with creation, that's how I try to do that. And the interesting that happens is if I just start and I just stop analyzing and stop trying to think, okay, but what am I going to write about? What kind of style do I have to do? If I just start playing around with some sounds and just being creative,
Yes.
oftentimes that's when that the ego leaves, and it is this it can be a very peaceful and fulfilling process, and
Yeah.
that's what brings me joy, because sometimes when I do that, I feel like I create really interesting and beautiful things for myself. And so, and then of course you finish, and then you're sitting there, and then the ego comes back, and you're like,
Of
oh, but
course. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
is
yeah.
it this
That's
good? You know,
and
which
and
is why it's addictive, I think.
I think so. And I would argue that that part of the process, at least, is very good for you psychologically and physically.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Right. You know, because for example, the moment when there'd be times when you've had like an insight, you know, or you felt like that's it. That's, you know, and people always report that as, I mean, sometimes they report it as relief from the impasse, but more commonly, people report it as joyous and uplifting and leading to flurries then of implications which they hurriedly pursue before they lose them, right? So you
Right.
get into a
Right.
writing sort of frenzy or a
Mm-hmm.
composing frenzy, you know, like, not frenzy is not the
Yeah.
right word. I think you know what I mean.
Yeah. No, but
Yeah,
it's
so
so true.
that's really interesting. And now the other thing that I had in my mind was in your journey from being, you know, a young fella to where, you know, your venerable age now, not as venerable as me, of course, is I've given this various names across the years, but it's this idea of multidimensionality. And I took it, I think it was a psychologist called Kaufman, he calls it cross-training. But anyway, the idea is that you have interests and passions in more than one domain.
Mm-hmm.
And there's this sort of cross-fertilization, right? And of course, one of the most common ways to do that is to collaborate with other people, because you're now getting the advantage of other people's minds, which can introduce ideas, introduce structures that you don't have in your brain.
Yeah, that's right.
So can you talk to me a little bit about that, about those two things, the sort of collaboration piece, but also the multiple interests? You made reference to that. You're always doing so many things.
Yeah.
I'd just be interested if you've connected those particular dots.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think collaboration is such a huge importance in music. And it was interesting when I first started music and I was playing in this band, and I was the sole songwriter in the band, and I was, you know, making the music with one of the other singers. And so for 10 years of like the first big chunk of my music pursuits, it was just writing with this one person, and you know, in this one project. And then it wasn't until I moved to America where the idea of collaboration and basically, you know, teamwork is much more open, and it's much
Yeah.
more of a thing. And so I started doing that, and it was at first it was a little bit intimidating, because I was like, I don't know this person. How am I supposed to, you know,
Yeah.
bare my soul and write lyrics with them and write this thing? And but I just did so much of it for so many years that I started to get really, I guess, good at it, and really addicted to it. And I think the biggest thing for me was I learned so much. I was able to just, yeah, like as I said earlier, I love music creation so much that I would be hovering over the shoulders of the person I was with, watching what they're doing on the computer, watching how they're playing things and what ideas they have, and then all of a sudden, you know, they would come up with something which would trigger some form of idea in my brain, and oftentimes you cannot get there without this collaboration aspect.
Yeah,
And
that's
so I
so
think it's,
interesting.
yeah,
Yeah,
I think that's really important. And some of
yeah,
my favorite songs I've written have been from collaborations with people.
yeah, yeah. Again,
And
I'm bursting to say a couple of things here. I should behave myself, but I can't.
Go for it.
Well, one of the things there is, I once used a metaphor for what happens is happening there in that collaboration. And by the way, the vast majority of human creativity is a collaborative venture. It's not
Yeah.
a solo activity, right? So
Right.
that it sometimes in the in the arts, especially in say writing, it's seen as a sort of solo pursuit or painting, and that
Yeah.
can obscure a much larger thing, that the species is creative, that
Mm.
children are creative, that you know we're inventing all the time, and it's on the shoulders of others always, right? So there's
Yeah.
that, but there's this other more immediate dimension, and that is, I don't know if you've ever seen a bricklayer
Mm.
build an arch. Have you ever watched a bricklayer do that?
No, but I've always been curious about how they build arches without it falling down.
Correct. Well, you're right
Yeah.
to be curious. Well, basically, what they do is they build the sides, but they have a bent plank, right?
Okay.
And then they lay the bricks around that bent plank at the top to make the arch, and
Hmm.
then they put in this last brick,
Yeah.
and it's like a wedge shape, and so it fits in perfectly,
Yeah.
right? And that one locks all the bricks together,
Oh,
and then
wow.
you
Okay.
then they can take away the frame, right?
Right. Interesting.
And that's what I think happens in collaboration. Other people's minds are like that frame,
Mm.
and then their frame is supporting us adding new ideas, new bricks, new things, and then eventually they can walk away, and we've still got the arch.
Yeah. That's very, very true. And that's a good visual representation of that, I think. Um,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
I love that. Really, really cool.
And so you're sort of literally, through neuroplasticity, as it were, you're kind of rewiring. You're adding structures in there that weren't there.
Yeah.
And so I think it's a very and it's an exciting thing because it liberates us from the constrictions of our own assumptions and what we know already, right?
Mm. Yeah. Yeah,
So
it's
there's a
true.
certain humility that's entailed in collaboration that we all have to learn, right?
Hmm.
And again, it's that ego thing that gets in the way of that, right? There's all these insecurities about what am I going to look like, and am I,
Yeah.
all that sort of stuff.
Yeah,
Uh,
of course.
okay, now look, I'm mindful of time, and there are those other topics. Remember, we had. Um, you mentioned to me that you've had some of your own, struggles with mental ill health. Did I hear you correctly? Is that right? Is
Yeah,
that
that's
something you
that's
wouldn't
correct.
mind talking about?
Yeah, sure.
Uh,
Um,
what
yeah,
was the nature of that, just briefly?
for sure. I mean, yeah, I'm an open book. And I think you being a psychologist and this being the topic of the conversation, it's a good
We do
jumping
have a
point.
big,
I think,
there's an audience out there though that so
yeah,
you be mindful.
for sure. No, I think the topic of mental health is interesting because I think specifically in the last, I would say, 10 to 15 years, it's become, in my opinion, a lot more accessible and a lot more
Definitely,
talked about.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Um, Considering, looking back when I grew up as a child and even a young teenager, the concept of going to a therapist was so taboo, and it was so like
yeah,
that's what people go there that are really messed up, which is so
yeah,
not true. And I think, and I never really knew that until I went through some stuff of my own. I think particularly, I mean, my story has been, you know, as everyone's is a little bit, what's the word? Kind of like a tumbleweed in a way. There's different
yeah.
moments and different
Mm.
areas of my struggles, but I think a big part of it was probably stems from this self-doubt thing. And I think like as I as I grew up and I moved to America, and um, I started to get very involved in the industry and in the community and stuff. I think it brought a lot of positives, but it also brought, for me, I started to develop this kind of like a workaholic attitude, and I was
Yeah,
very, very obsessed with work and creating, and I think that led to a lot of moments of burnout,
yeah,
particularly in my early days living in LA, and that was quite interesting because all of a sudden I would wake up and I would be physically exhausted and very emotional as well, and
yeah,
I would, and I think with my story, without getting too much into the details, I think a lot of mental health stuff stems from younger years and childhood, and and trauma. And I think I carried a lot of that into later life. And I think I used work as a bit of a crutch and a bit of a thing to lean on, but that only lasts for so long. And so, and it was interesting because as I started to make good friendships in LA, and I started to go through some of these moments, there was a period where I would wake up feeling very just physically exhausted. I couldn't do anything. I was very also like a little bit sad, and I started to talk to some friends about it, and all of a sudden I realized that people start to kind of feel the same way as me, and so that was really interesting, and that led to then 2020 when it was the pandemic, and that I think for me was the biggest point, because I all of a sudden was very isolated and I didn't have access to these friendships. I was living in Los Angeles and all of my family was in Australia. My girlfriend was in Germany, and I didn't have any access so much to people in my life as did everyone at that time.
That's right.
I also went through decades of chronic pain. I had an issue in my neck, and that led me to basically having so much pain that I would have these days where I couldn't really walk so much. I felt debilitated at a very young age. And so all of this came to a catalyst in 2020, and I ended up getting really depressed. And I went to a spinal surgeon, and they found something wrong with my neck. And so they recommended a spinal surgery I think I was 27, which felt crazy to me. So I went through this, and then the recovery process was really long. And this was probably the deepest pit of my mental health struggles. And it was at the recommendation of my girlfriend and some close friends that I should see a therapist. And I started to see one, and it changed my life, truly. All of a sudden I started talking about stuff I didn't even think was an issue. And I think that for me has been the biggest understanding of mental health, is that I think how you're feeling can be, obviously directed at how you're feeling in the moment, but also from years and years of stuff that you've been through that you've never really gotten out. And so I started to really work. And then the workaholic in me came back, and I was like, I'm going to win therapy. I'm going to do it the best. And which I think is a problem in itself. And I've learned to since take it easy. But, I was doing a lot of journaling. I was doing a lot of meditation. I was really digging up everything I could from my past and anything that I thought has bothered me. And it was very healing, actually. And I did that for quite a long time. And since then I've been with other therapists, some that have been not great for me and some that have been really great for me. And I think it's the biggest lesson I've learned out of it is that I don't think that it's a thing that you can fix and then you're done. I think it's a lifelong thing that is really important to try and deal with, actually. So that's I guess that's the story in a nutshell.
It's quite a story, and thank you, for your candor about that.
Yeah, of course.
And obviously, it's really helpful for others who might be teetering on the edge of talking to someone. And as you say, it has opened up. People are more open to it than they were, and that's a great thing. A couple of little things there I'm interested in. And I'm very glad that it sounds like the spinal surgery was helpful. And
it was. Thankfully, it was. Yeah.
Yeah, which is fantastic. And I'm assuming a couple of things again, that in that period, your artistic creativity would have been pretty low, right?
It was. Yeah.
So I just say that because it's obvious to you, but there very often is this sort of people conflate that kind of suffering with high creativity, and actually the opposite's true. When people are really unwell, they don't create much. Or what they create is not that great. However, they might mine those experiences for the rest of their life, and very fruitfully.
Yes.
So the content of your writing can be drawn from some of those profound experiences, and it increases your empathic reach and connection with others. So they're not to be wasted, but they're certainly not to be encouraged in their own right, because, as I often say, you don't have to add to life's sufferings because it's going to give you plenty.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
And there's always going to be plenty to write about.
Mm.
The other thing is the therapeutic work you've done is in many senses cathartic,
Mm.
right?
Yeah.
And I'm wondering too whether your creative process, especially post the therapeutic work, is a continuation of that catharsis.
Yeah, I would say so. I think, well, also to touch on what you just mentioned about holding
Yeah,
on to these experiences is so true in my case. I do recall during this period of about it was probably a couple of years that was truly in the thick of it. I
yeah,
wasn't very creative, and I was very frustrated at that because I felt like I had lost something of myself, which was
yeah,
a big part of
yeah,
my life. Um, and maybe some people call it like a writer's block, or maybe it's just the fact that it's hard to be positive and creative when you're going through a depression.
yeah,
But having gone through those experiences, it's definitely been I'm very thankful for it because, as you said, uh, the empathy thing is so true. Like going through all that has made me, I think, a more empathic person, and it has given me more content to draw from when I write,
yeah,
um, and reflecting on that has been very powerful. And one of my best friends went through a similar thing with his neck, and he had a really crazy pain for many years and went through therapy and surgery, and I was able to relate to him on a level that no one else could because I went
yeah,
through pretty much the exact same thing. And I think that was very powerful for me, and that kind of brought us closer. So I think that's,
yeah.
in my experience, the beauty of going through some of these struggles is like if and when you can get through them, it's an amazing thing and a powerful thing to have in your back pocket,
Yes,
that
and
teaches you things,
I
I
think
think.
it does, and I think it really builds character, and it creates
Yeah,
depth and
yeah,
nuance. And
yeah.
the other thing that occurred to me when you're talking is in your songwriting. Then, like you strike me, as a pretty positive chap. I don't feel
Yeah,
like I'm talking to a depressive here.
right.
Now
Right.
I know you're going to have your ups and downs like I do, but
Yeah,
my point is that you can now speak authentically to these experiences, but from a different place, from a
yeah, that's
place
right.
of hope, of hopefulness, of
Yeah.
the capacity to learn from it and move forward without
Mm,
trivializing it, right? And I think that this is
yeah.
a very important role that artists like yourself have. Um,
Yeah.
Especially people that we know there's real issues with mental health worldwide,
Mm,
currently, and people often turn to music
yeah.
with a real fervor and a depth of longing,
Yeah,
to
that's right.
so they may not go to a shrink like me, but they might go to a concert, and
Yeah.
memorize lyrics that are
Yeah.
meaningful to them. So there's that. That's a wonderful contribution. Now, our time is running very fast here. And there was
Yeah.
just one other thing I wanted to pick up from what you said. You mentioned obsessiveness a few times, and you might
Hmm.
remember I talked about a great predictor of creativity is how much you produce. But
Mm.
there's another dimension to this, and that is there's been some really good research on perfectionism,
Oh, yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And as a psych getting trained, pretty much the way that was taught to me was it's always bad, right? Because
Hmm.
people are setting unrealistic goals and then they're always falling short of them, or even
Hmm.
when they do something perfect, it's a relief, and then they're back on the wheel the next day.
Yeah. Yeah.
But in my consulting and in a lot of my work, I've worked with some very, very highly productive, very successful people who swear to me that their perfectionism is the source of their success.
Okay. Interesting.
And early on, I sort of tried to hold out against that. I wasn't being probably as empathetic as I should because
Mm.
I knew,
Mm. Right.
but then eventually started to reveal to me that there's two different types of obsessiveness and perfectionism.
Yeah.
One is actually healthy and the other unhealthy.
Yeah.
And the one that's unhealthy is one that's really centered on fear.
Yes, that's so true.
And particularly fear of social judgment. You know, we're back to where we started with that sort of social comparison and self-consciousness and self-concern. The other healthy kind is this kind where we're just striving to improve, you know, to make small improvements, not massive ones, but constant small improvements. So it's driven by curiosity and passion. And this, I think, is the sort of very healthy path to creativity.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Where we're doing something that we love, we find it meaningful, and we just want to perfect it.
Yeah.
And we know it will never get there, and that's okay.
That's true. Yeah.
Well, look, as always in these conversations, you can kind of tell, Drew, that we could talk for quite a long time here, but I think for today our time is up, and I just want to thank you a great deal. First off, it was a super pleasure to meet you.
Likewise. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, and also just to thank you for as I said, your candor and your openness. It'll be really helpful to people, and who knows, we might be able to do part 2 one day.
That'd be great.
And you know, we'll drill down into something a little more properly rather than just sort of, skipping along lightly on each topic. But for now, many thanks, and we'll talk again.
Thanks, Chris. Greatly appreciate it. Great to meet you, and thanks for having me.
Likewise. Good. You've been listening to the Psychology to Live By podcast. If you'd like to know more, go to my website at drchris.life. And please share the podcast with people you like, so they can like it too. And the gently uplifting song by Portair that you've been listening to in the background is called Afterglow.